I don't even know why I'm writing this. Maybe to convince myself it really happened. Maybe because there's no one left who cares to listen. My name's Curtis Mayfield, no, not the singer, just a regular guy who always believed that love could survive anything if you just tried hard enough. Maybe that was my first mistake. It all started with a glove. Yeah, you read that right, not a fight, not a text message, not even a lipstick stain. A single, delicate, ivory glove? I found it tucked into the passenger seat of Delaney's car one cold November evening. It wasn't hers. She never wore gloves, said they made her feel trapped. I turned that glove over in my hands for 10 minutes, feeling like an idiot, convincing myself it must belong to one of her friends, or maybe she picked it up accidentally. Because that's what you do when you're desperate, right? You lie to yourself first. Delaney and I had been together for 9 years. Married for 6. She was everything I wasn't, charismatic, confident, magnetic. Wherever she went, people followed, including me. She used to say I was her safe place. Her calm. Her home. But lately, she'd been spending a lot of nights working late or catching up with old friends. I asked questions, but they always ended with her laughing and calling me paranoid. Still, something about that glove gnawed at me. It smelled faintly of perfume, not Delaney's brand. Something heavier. Muskier. It clung to the fabric like a secret. I should have confronted her right then. I should have asked. Instead, I shoved the glove into the back of my drawer and pretended it didn't exist. Coward. That's what I am. A man too afraid to pull at the thread unraveling his own life. Fast forward 3 weeks. It's the annual Rosewood Gala, the biggest social event of the year in our town. Black tie, crystal chandeliers, everyone pretending their marriages are perfect and their bank accounts are overflowing. Delaney was ecstatic. She spent days picking out a dress, hours at the salon. She looked like something out of a dream when she stepped out of the bedroom that night, all shimmering gold and effortless beauty. And me? I smiled. I told her she looked stunning. Inside, I felt like I was walking into my own funeral. At the gala, Delaney floated around the room like royalty. Everyone wanted a piece of her. I stood by the punch table, sipping flat champagne, watching her twirl away from me. Watching her laugh a little too loudly at some man's joke. Watching her body lean a little too close. I should have left. I should have spared myself the final blow. But like a moth to the flame, I stayed. And that's when I saw it. Near the grand staircase, under the soft glow of a chandelier, Delaney reached for someone's hand. Not mine. His. A man in a dark navy suit, hair too perfect to be anything but a lie. She squeezed his hand like it was second nature. Like it belonged to her. I didn't make a scene. I didn't yell. I didn't even walk up to them. Instead, I waited. Waited until she finally noticed me standing there, watching. Delaney froze. Her hand slipped from his like she had touched fire. She started toward me, a guilty smile twisting across her lips, and she reached out just like always, expecting me to play my part. To forgive. To forget. But this time I didn't move. I looked her in the eyes, my throat dry, my hands shaking, and I whispered, not this time. Not again. The music kept playing. The people kept laughing. But in that moment, for me, the whole world cracked. And that, my friends, was only the beginning. Because sometimes the worst betrayals don't happen in a bedroom, they happen in a ballroom under chandeliers while everyone smiles and pretends not to notice. And trust me, nobody ever forgets the first time they say no. I didn't storm out that night. I didn't even raise my voice. Maybe part of me still hoped I had misread the moment, that there was some explanation I couldn't yet see. Hope is a stubborn parasite like that, it survives where nothing else should. I walked out of that ballroom slowly, my shoes clicking against the marble floor, the weight of 1,000 invisible stairs pressing against my back. Maybe some of them pitied me. Maybe some of them laughed behind their champagne glasses. It didn't matter. Outside, the winter air slapped me in the face, sharp and real. For the first time in months, I felt awake. Alive but hollow. I stood under the heavy stone arch of the Rosewood Hotel, watching couples filter past me, laughing, drunk on glamour. I could still see Delaney through the glass doors, standing frozen where I had left her, confusion and panic battling across her face. I pulled my coat tighter around me and walked into the night without looking back. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew it couldn't be back home. Not to the house where her laughter still echoed in the hallways. Not to the bed where she had promised me forever. I ended up at Miller's Diner. A 24-hour greasy spoon that smelled like burnt coffee and broken dreams. It was the kind of place people went when they didn't want to be found. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the back corner and ordered black coffee. Even though my stomach churned at the thought of drinking it, I sat there for hours, replaying every conversation, every missed red flag, Every moment I chose her smile over my own instincts. Was it the late meetings? The mysterious trips to her mother's house she never invited me to join? The sudden new passwords on everything she owned? Maybe it wasn't any one thing. Maybe it was all of it, stitched together into a truth I had been too weak to face. My phone buzzed relentlessly in my pocket. I didn't look. Couldn't. The coward in me wanted to believe it was Delaney, full of apologies and desperate explanations. But the growing anger inside me knew better. She wasn't sorry. She was scared. Scared that her carefully crafted life was crumbling at her feet. Around 3 a.m., the night manager gave me a pitying glance and refilled my coffee without asking. I stared into the cup like it held the answers to my shattered world. How do you mourn someone who's still alive? How do you grieve a life that was never truly yours to begin with? It wasn't until the first light of dawn cracked across the horizon that I finally stood up. My legs were stiff, my heart heavier than it had ever been. I paid my check, tucked a $5 bill under the chipped mug, and stepped back into the freezing morning air. The glove was still in my pocket. I don't know why I had brought it. Maybe as proof that I hadn't imagined it all. Maybe as a reminder that even the smallest things could tear an entire world apart. When I finally got home, the house was dark, cold, empty in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of people. Her car was in the driveway, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Instead, I stood on the porch, staring at the door I had unlocked 1,000 times before, feeling like a stranger at my own home. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. Behind that door were memories I didn't want to face. Behind that door was the ghost of a life I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. And somewhere inside, waiting for me, was Delaney, with her excuses, her tears, her rehearsed apologies. But I was no longer the man who would bend. Not this time. Not again. I finally stepped inside. The house felt foreign, like some abandoned museum of a life I didn't recognize anymore. Delaney's heels were kicked off near the door, a careless habit she had since college. Her coat was slung across the arm of the couch. I could hear the faint clinking of a spoon against a mug coming from the kitchen. She was making tea. Tea, like it was just another quiet morning and not the aftermath of betrayal she had carefully built behind my back. I stood there for a moment, dripping melted frost onto the hardwood floor, unsure whether to laugh or collapse. Part of me wanted to scream. Part of me wanted to walk right past her, out the back door, and never look back. But instead I stayed, like a fool, like a man who hadn't yet learned how to let go. When she saw me, Delaney smiled. A soft, apologetic smile, the one she always used when she wanted to downplay something, to tuck it neatly under the rug of our marriage. "Hey, baby," she said, stirring her tea slowly, like she had rehearsed the casual tone. "I've been so worried. I tried calling. I didn't answer." I hung my coat on the hook by the door, my fingers trembling slightly. I didn't trust my voice yet, and silence felt safer. She walked toward me cautiously, like approaching a wounded animal. "We should talk," she said. "I know how it looked, but—" I raised a hand. Not angrily, just tiredly. I couldn't hear the lies yet. "Not yet. Not now," I said hoarsely. "Not when I can still smell his cologne on you." That broke her mask. She flinched like I had slapped her. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Curtis, you're blowing this out of proportion. It was just a stupid moment. A mistake. It didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything." God, how many times had those words been used to justify the slow death of love? I shook my head, feeling like I was watching a movie where I already knew every line, every ending. "Then why did it feel like it meant everything to you when you touched him?" I asked quietly. She had no answer. Of course she didn't. There was no script for when the curtain finally falls. Delaney sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. She started crying, but even her tears sounded rehearsed. I leaned against the doorframe, exhausted. Not just tired from the night, but tired from years of pretending that everything was fine. That her distance was my fault. That if I just loved her harder, better, stronger, she would stay. "I found the glove," I said after a moment. 3 weeks ago. I didn't say anything. I wanted to believe you. I wanted so badly to believe you. Her sobbing stopped abruptly. She looked up at me with wide, scared eyes. She knew exactly which glove. She knew exactly what it meant. Curtis, she whispered. Please. It was nothing. You're my husband. You're the one I love. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Love? No. Love doesn't hide. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't leave gloves behind like breadcrumbs for the brokenhearted. I think you loved what I could give you, I said softly. Safety. A place to land when the other thrill rides ended. But you were never really here, were you, Delaney? She started crying again, louder this time, almost theatrical. Maybe she believed the performance. Maybe she needed to. I didn't. Not anymore. I turned and walked upstairs without another word, leaving her sobs to echo through the empty spaces between us. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wedding photo on the nightstand. 2 kids grinning stupidly at a future they thought they could control. I hated them a little in that moment. I hated their innocence, their arrogance, because they had no idea how easily one careless hand, one whispered lie, one wrong step could destroy everything. And tomorrow, I realized grimly, would be the day I started tearing down the life we had built. One brick at a time. Morning crept in slow and heavy, like it didn't want to be part of this mess either. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window all night, watching the world outside turn from black to bruised gray. Delaney never came upstairs. I imagined her curled up on the living room couch, replaying the night in her mind, trying to calculate how much of the truth she could spin back into a lie. I stared at the wedding photo again. I must have picked it up 100 times, turning it over in my hands, tracing the frame. Every time, I put it back down. I didn't smash it like they do in movies. I didn't scream or throw it against the wall. I just kept looking at it like if I stared long enough, maybe I could step into that picture and warn the man I used to be. Get out while you can. She doesn't love you the way you love her. Around 6 a.m. I finally moved. I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and started packing. Not much, just the essentials. A few shirts, some jeans, my old sneakers. The kinds of things a man takes when he knows he's not coming back. I could hear Delaney's soft footsteps downstairs. She wasn't making noise this time. No banging of pots to remind me she was there. No forced sighs or muttered complaints. Just silence. Heavy and thick. I zipped the bag and looked around the room one last time. It wasn't just the place we slept. It was the place we made plans. Shared secrets. Dreamed of a family we never quite got around to having. Maybe that was a blessing in disguise. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. When I came downstairs, she was sitting at the kitchen table, her hair a tangled mess, her eyes swollen from crying. She clutched a coffee mug like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Just stared at me like she barely recognized who I was anymore. Maybe she didn't. Maybe I didn't either. Where are you going? She asked, her voice raw. Somewhere you're not, I said simply. Her face crumpled like paper. She dropped the mug and it shattered against the tile floor. 1,000 pieces just like us. Curtis, please, she gasped. Don't throw this away. We can fix it. I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll cut him off. I'll quit my job. Just, don't leave. Funny how the fear only comes when they realize the cage door is open. I stood there, the duffel strap digging into my shoulder, and for a second, a painful, stupid second, I almost believed her. I almost wanted to believe that things could be stitched back together if we just wanted it badly enough. But love built on lies is a castle made of paper. Beautiful from a distance. Useless in the rain. You already threw it away, I said, my voice low, almost gentle. You just didn't think I'd notice. She got up and came toward me, barefoot, stepping over shards of porcelain like they weren't there. She reached out, that same damned instinct, to touch my face, to pull me back into the life she destroyed. I stepped back. She froze, her hand hanging between us like a white flag she didn't really mean to wave. Don't, I said. Not this time. Never again. Her mouth opened in protest, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. I turned and walked out the front door. I didn't slam it. I didn't look back. The cold hit me like a wall, but it felt better than the false warmth I was leaving behind. I got in my car, started the engine with shaking hands, and pulled away from the curb. The sun was rising over the neighborhood, painting everything in soft pink and gold. It looked almost beautiful. Almost. But I knew better now. Paper castles look beautiful too, until you realize the rain is coming. The first night away was worse than anything I could have imagined. I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled faintly of mildew and lost hope. The walls were thin, the lights buzzed, and the bed sagged in the middle. Still, it was better than the home I had left behind, better than sleeping next to a woman who could hold another man's hand one moment and swear loyalty to me the next. I laid awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of televisions and distant arguments seeping through the walls. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just existed, empty and exhausted, like a balloon someone forgot to tie shut, slowly leaking into nothing. In the silence, I started thinking about all the things I never said to Delaney. The truths I swallowed to keep the peace. The doubts I buried so deep even I started believing they didn't matter. I grabbed the hotel's scratchy notepad from the nightstand and started writing, not because I thought I'd send the letters, but because some things needed to be exorcised before they ate me alive. Dear Delaney, I always knew you loved the way I made you feel more than you loved me. I just thought if I loved you enough for both of us, it would be enough. I tore the page off and started another. Dear Delaney, I wasn't blind. I saw the way you looked at other men like they were fireworks and I was just a flickering candle. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself you chose me every day. But you didn't. You chose what I gave you, not who I was. Page after page. Confession after confession. Things I never dared say out loud because I was too busy trying to be the good husband, the forgiving man, the understanding partner. All titles that meant nothing when the one person you trusted most saw you as replaceable. By the time the sun began to rise, I had a small mountain of crumpled paper on the floor beside the bed. I hadn't slept at all, but for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something closer to clarity. Delaney called 6 times that morning. I didn't answer. She texted me long, desperate messages, mixing apologies with memories, trying to remind me of the good times, the life we had built, the promises we made. She sent old photos of us at the lake, at our first apartment, laughing over burnt pancakes in the kitchen. It would have been easier if she had been cruel, if she had thrown blame at me. But no, she wanted to stay the victim. She wanted to pull at my heartstrings, to make me question if walking away was the real betrayal. I sat there, staring at the buzzing phone, and realized something painful but undeniable. She missed the idea of me. The safety. The stability. Not me. Not the man bleeding out in a cheap motel room surrounded by unsent letters and the ruins of his own denial. By noon, I packed my things, left the motel key on the dresser, and drove nowhere in particular. The town felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. Every corner, every street lamp, every gas station held a memory of us. Places where we kissed, argued, promised forever. But forever was a fragile thing. And I was done carrying the weight of a promise she had shattered so easily. I needed to leave. Not just the house. Not just the marriage. I needed to leave the version of me that thought love could survive anything if you just held on tight enough. Because sometimes holding on is the very thing that drowns you. And I was tired of drowning. I didn't have a plan when I left the motel. No destination. No grand vision of starting over somewhere new. Just a hollow ache in my chest and a desperate need to put distance between myself and the life I could no longer stand to look at. I ended up driving east, out toward the old parts of the county where the houses grew farther apart and the roads turned to cracked asphalt lined with dying trees. The radio stayed off. I didn't want to hear songs about love or second chances. I didn't want to hear anything at all. After a few hours, I pulled into a forgotten town, one of those places that had clearly been dying for years but nobody bothered to bury it. Peeling paint on shuttered storefronts, an abandoned gas station with one rusted pump leaning sideways like a drunk old man, and a diner with a flickering open sign barely clinging to life. It felt fitting. I parked outside the diner, walked in, and took a seat at the counter. The waitress, a woman who looked like life had broken her in a dozen different ways but hadn't quite killed her spirit, handed me a menu without saying a word. I ordered coffee and a grilled cheese. It arrived lukewarm and sad-looking, but it was food, and for the first time in 2 days I realized how empty my stomach was. I ate mechanically, chewing around the lump in my throat. Around me, a few old men played cards at a table in the corner. A teenage boy scribbled into a battered notebook. Nobody asked questions. Nobody cared who I was or what I was running from. It was exactly what I needed. Halfway through my coffee, my phone buzzed again. A message from Delaney. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew what it would say: more apologies, more promises, more desperate attempts to rewind time. She thought she could patch the cracks with enough "I'm sorry"s. But what she didn't understand, what she would never understand, was that some things can't be unbroken. Some betrayals don't fade with time, they calcify, becoming part of who you are. I tossed a few crumpled bills onto the counter and headed back to my car. The sun was beginning to sink behind the gray buildings, casting long, mournful shadows across the street. I didn't want to go back to the city. I didn't want to go back to the memories. And most of all, I didn't want to go back to being the man who would have forgiven her. I drove around aimlessly as the last light drained from the sky. The air grew colder, sharper. I passed empty barns, rusted swing sets, houses with sagging porches and hollow windows. Places where life used to exist but had long since packed up and moved on. Like me. At some point, I pulled onto a dirt road and parked at the edge of a frozen lake. I sat there for a long time, watching the wind ripple across the surface, listening to the creak of bare branches overhead. It was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not just the absence of noise, but the absence of expectation. Of judgment. I leaned back in the seat, closed my eyes, and let myself feel it, all of it. The grief. The rage. The crushing sadness of realizing the life you built was a lie you co-authored. It would have been easy to hate her. To turn every good memory sour and paint her as the villain in every chapter. But deep down, I knew the truth was more complicated. She hadn't set out to hurt me. She had just been too selfish, too broken herself to love me the way I deserved. And I had been too scared of being alone to see it. Maybe we were both guilty. Maybe we were just two people clinging to a fairy tale because the real world was too sharp, too cruel. Either way, it was over. I stared out at the frozen water until the stars blinked into view, tiny and cold and distant. Tomorrow, I decided I would start over. Not perfectly. Not heroically. But honestly. Without her. Without the man I used to be. And for the first time in a long, long while, that thought didn't terrify me. It almost felt like hope. The next morning, I woke up in the car to the thin, bitter light of dawn creeping through the windshield. My neck was stiff, my back ached, and the condensation on the windows made everything outside look blurred and distant, like a world I didn't quite belong to anymore. But somehow I felt lighter. Not good exactly. Not healed. But like I had finally put down a weight I had been carrying so long I forgot what it felt like to stand up straight. I didn't rush to start the car. I just sat there, listening to the brittle silence of the frozen woods around me. There was no plan. No list. No one expecting anything from me. For the first time in years, there was only me. Eventually, I pulled out my phone, half expecting another flood of texts from Delaney. But there was nothing. No new messages. No missed calls. Just silence. And that was when it hit me, she had given up. Maybe it was her pride. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe she realized I was serious this time, that no apology would sew up what she had ripped apart. Whatever the reason, her silence spoke louder than any desperate voicemail ever could. It hurt. God, it hurt. It felt like tearing my own skin off. But under the pain, buried deep, was a strange, stubborn spark of something else, something almost like relief. She was gone. And now I could finally be too. I started the car and pulled back onto the main road. I wasn't going back to the city. Not today. Maybe not ever. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew it would be somewhere new. Somewhere her shadow didn't reach. As I drove, I thought about all the versions of myself I had been during our marriage, the cheerleader, the peacekeeper, the forgiver. I had twisted myself into shapes trying to fit the space Delaney needed filled, believing that if I just tried harder, loved louder, hurt quieter, it would be enough. But it never was. Because Betrayal love doesn't demand you become smaller to fit someone else's world. Somewhere along the way, I had started measuring my worth by her attention. By whether she chose me that day, that hour, that moment. And that's not love. That's survival. I deserved more. Even if it terrified me. Even if I didn't know how to believe it yet. Hours later, I rolled into a small coastal town I had never heard of before. It was the kind of place with crooked wooden signs for mom and pop stores, docks stretching out into the gray sea, and a faint smell of salt and old dreams in the air. I checked into a tiny inn with peeling paint and a sign that said vacancy swinging in the cold breeze. The woman at the front desk didn't ask questions. Just handed me a key and pointed down the hallway. Room 7. It felt symbolic somehow. Like the world was giving me a fresh start wrapped up in a number. I dropped my bag on the creaky bed and stood by the window watching the waves crash against the rocks in the distance. Violent. Beautiful. Unstoppable. Just like healing would be. Not pretty. Not easy. But real. I didn't cry that night. I didn't drink. I didn't scroll through old pictures or reread her last messages. I just sat there in that tiny room listening to the sea hammer the shore and allowed myself to believe maybe for the first time that I was going to be okay. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But someday. And that someday didn't include chasing after someone who had already chosen to let me go long before I ever walked away. The days that followed were quiet, and for the first time in a long while, I let them be. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I didn't run from the empty spaces Delaney had left behind. I let the loneliness wash over me, and when it passed, what remained was something steadier. Stronger. Each morning, I walked down to the docks with a cup of terrible motel coffee in hand, watching the fishermen haul in their nets as the sun clawed its way over the horizon. The world kept turning, indifferent to my heartbreak, and somehow that made me feel better, like maybe my pain wasn't as permanent as it had felt that night at the gala. I got a job at a local hardware store by the end of the first week. Nothing glamorous, nothing big, just simple, honest work. I stocked shelves, loaded lumber, fixed broken locks. I didn't have to be anyone's husband there. I didn't have to live up to anyone's expectations. I could just be Curtis, the guy who showed up on time and didn't mind sweeping the floors at closing. The owner, a wiry old man named Dean, didn't ask many questions. When I told him I was new in town, he just nodded and handed me a worn-out apron. "Everyone's running from something," he said with a shrug. "You're not special. Welcome aboard." It was the best welcome I'd gotten in years. At night, I read old paperbacks from the thrift store down the road. I watched the stars from the little bench behind the inn. I wrote letters I never intended to send, but now they weren't to Delaney. They were to myself. Promises of the man I wanted to become. Slowly, without even noticing it happening, the ache in my chest started to fade. It didn't disappear overnight. Healing never works that way. Some days I still thought about her, about the life we could have had if things had been different. But those thoughts didn't drown me anymore. They passed like clouds across a wide sky, noticed and then forgotten. One morning, about a month after I arrived, I woke up before dawn and walked down to the shore. The tide was low and the sand was cool beneath my shoes. The world was still holding its breath, waiting for the first light. And when the sun finally broke over the horizon, it wasn't a dramatic, cinematic moment. It wasn't a revelation. It was simple, gentle, beautiful. It was enough. I stood there, hands in my pockets, feeling the soft morning breeze against my skin, and I realized I hadn't just left Delaney. I had found myself. Not the man who begged to be loved. Not the man who twisted himself into knots to keep someone by his side. A man who knew his own worth. A man who didn't need to be chosen to know he mattered. I smiled, really smiled, for the first time in what felt like forever. And as the new day spread across the sea, I finally walked forward. Not away from the past, but towards something new. Towards something better. Toward myself.